Good evening and welcome. I am Elliot Abraham, the founder and CTO of Cloudfinity. I want to talk to you tonight about container security. I did a talk this week at Osaka's Geek Week 2018 where I spoke about the top 10 security best practices for moving to the public cloud. One of those best practices was how to properly contain and secure your serverless and your container environments. So let's get into take a look at just one piece of how one could secure containers. So let me give you a scenario. Imagine a scenario where you have an organization that's using a shared Kubernetes cluster, and that shared cluster is being used for development and production use cases. Now, the development team, they want to maintain that space in the cluster where they could get a list of all of their pods, services, and deployment, and they're always developing, they're building applications all the time. So for them, they need a more relaxed, agile environment. Now, the operations teams, on the other hand, who actually maintains the production environment, they want to maintain their cluster so that it can enforce strict procedures on who can and cannot manipulate the pods, the services, and deployment. Now, the question is, how do you do that? Well, I'm sure that there are several ways that that can be done, but tonight we're just going to talk about a construct in Kubernetes called namespaces. Namespaces helps helps Kubernetes users to utilize different projects and teams and customers. They can use a shared Kubernetes cluster for that services for that purpose. Kubernetes namespaces it is actually a scope for the names construct, and it is also a mechanism to attach authorization and policy to a subsection of a cluster. So with that being said, just giving you a backdrop of what namespaces are and what they do. Let's take a look at how we can understand and deploy namespaces. So by now, I'm assuming that you are somewhat familiar with Kubernetes. We will go in greater detail at a later time, but I just want to show you these things. So right now, what you see, this is a default Kubernetes deployment. And these three namespaces are the ones that are there always by default. You have your default namespace, and so any service, any deployment, any pod that hasn't been given a specific namespace will always live in the default namespace. Then there is kube public for any services that need to be publicly facing for the internet, and then there's kube system, and that's where resources that the Kubernetes system will put resources in that particular namespace there. Now, in order for us to leverage namespaces, we need to create a couple of scopes. We need to create a namespace scope to hold our work. So we're going to create two scopes. We'll create a scope for development, and in this scope, it's a simple JSON file where we give it the kind of scope is namespace. The name is going to be development here, and we're going to give it a label of development. And for the sake of time, we've also done the same thing here for production, giving it the name production and also the label of production. So now we just need to run this command. We're going to run this command so we can create this scope for dev. So dev is created. Now we're going to do the same thing for production. We're going to run this command, and we're going to create the production namespace. Now, let's take a look, and let's see what we have. Remember when we looked at it before, we just saw the three namespaces. So now we see two additional namespaces that have been created. Name equals and we're also showing their labels. Name equals development and name equals production. Now, if we wanted to create some pods in a specific namespace, this is how we would do that. If I wanted to create a pod in in the dev namespace, then I need to switch context. So I'm going to use kubectl config use dash context dev. And now I can create, now that I'm in the dev context, any resource that I create here in this namespace will only live in the development namespace. But now I want to, now that I want to create some resources in the production namespace. So have to switch to that namespace. And let's make sure we're in the production namespace. We are in the production namespace. Let's see. There are no resources found there. No resources, no pods are found. Now, I want to create some resources called cattle in the production namespace. So we run this command, and there are, those have been created. Let's take a look at the deployment. That's my deployment. Those are now being created. One of the things that you need to be aware of is that when you are operating in a shared environment, a shared cluster, there are going to be some resource issues that you'll need to deal with, and so there you're going to have to use some resource quotas. You're going to have to use resource quotas. That's outside of the scope of this demonstration tonight, but maybe next week I'll come back and I'll do another one, and I'll show you how to create some scopes to limit the use of resources, resource quotas per namespace. For example, you might want to limit the number of pods that can be launched in your dev space, and you also want to make sure that the dev space cannot consume all of the resources on the node from the production namespace. But next week we'll get into how we can do that and extend this a little further. We want to make sure that we're understanding Kubernetes and how we can apply strong security to our containers so that they're not being used for malicious purposes, as was used in the Tesla hack, where Tesla was hacked and their their Amazon AWS resources were used for crypto mining. But that's all the time I have tonight, folks. Again, my name is Elliot Abraham. You can follow us on Twitter at Cloudfinity Labs. You can also connect with us on LinkedIn. Again, we're at Cloudfinity Labs on LinkedIn, or you can just visit us on the web at cloudfinity.io. Thank you, and we look forward to hearing from you soon. See you next week.